Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, AlbyMTG. For today's video, Wizards of the Coast has released the entire spoiler now for Ravnica Allegiance, so we now know every single card in the set. I'm not going to go over every single card that was previewed today like I normally do, because there was like 80 some cards previewed today and it would just be way too long of a video, especially with how I with how I do mine, since they're like in-depth analysis and we spend like 3 or 4 minutes on each card. But I am going to point out some of the commons that I think are pretty good for limited, possibly popper playable, and yeah, it should be a pretty fun time. At the end of the video, we'll go back and, since I didn't make a video yesterday, we'll talk about the additional spoilers that were spoiled yesterday, as well as later on Wednesday night once my video went live and they spoiled a couple cards as the video was uploading. So with that being said, let's talk about some Ravnica Allegiance cards. So Arrester's Zeal is pretty good as like the little combat trick that we have in the set. There's normally the 1 mana +2/+2 instant speed effect in this set. I do like this one. If you cast it during your main phase, it gains flying instead, so it could be a sorcery speed Mighty Leap, which is still pretty strong. Exposed to Daylight I think is pretty interesting here as well. Instant speed, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and then scry one. I think this is pretty interesting because we've seen Invoke the Divine see play in Standard a little bit in some of the control decks, and that card is basically the same thing here, except you gain 4 life instead of scrying one, so I think it'll be interesting to see if people in that Invoke the Divine slot, whether people are just going to stick with Invoke the Divine, or whether they might switch over to Exposed to Daylight and get that scry one instead of the gain 4 life. Impassioned Orator is another one here. 2 mana for a 2/2. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So again, for some sort of a Soul Sisters deck, this adds a little bit of a bigger creature to that deck. Most of them are 1 mana 1/1s. This, again, for something like Pauper, for example, if you're playing Soul Sisters, a lot of times your entire deck just folds to something like Electrickery, so Impassioned Orator being able to survive an Electrickery could be pretty relevant for like a Pauper Soul Sisters deck. Nothing really stands out in these cards. I do like the 10th District Veteran, 3 mana 2/3 Vigilance. Whenever it attacks, untap another target creature you control. So again, for limited, this card is going to be sort of like a giving another creature vigilance every time it attacks, which can be really good because in white you might have some creatures that you want to get in with some damage with, but also wouldn't mind if they died when they went to block, because they maybe have the afterlife ability or have some other sort of effect. And even if you're in something, for example, like Azorius, you might have one of those bigger blue creatures that they sometimes print in these sets, where you're going to want to have that blue creature attack in for, maybe 5 damage, something like that, and then you can also give it vigilance here, which is something you normally wouldn't see from blue, and so then you would have the ability to have your 5/5 also back on defense a little bit here as well. Chillbringer I think is a kind of a fun one. I like this sort of effect. The enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Cards like Watertrap Weaver and Frostlinks are some of my favorite cards in the game. I'm probably a little bit biased towards them, and maybe this card isn't as good as I think it is, but I do genuinely like that effect. And so Chillbringer is just kind of like a bigger one of those. You can't play as many of these as you would, a Frostlinks or a Watertrap Weaver, because it is 5 mana, but you also get an evasive body to go along with this one, so I think that's pretty nice here. Nothing else really stands out on that page. Precognitive Perception is something we've already talked about, so I don't really know why it's here. Sagero's Savant is another one, 2 mana 2/1, and when it enters the battlefield, scry 2. I love Omen Speaker, so again, kind of a similar effect to this one, except it's a little bit more aggressive than an Omen Speaker would be, which I personally like a lot better. Fairy Duelist, 2 mana 1/2 Flash Flyer. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. I kind of like this one as well. Giving a blue card, or having a blue card with flash on it seems quite good, because you can hold a potential counter magic and then flash this guy in, and at the same time it's defensive, which is something you might want to be out of blue, especially if you're some sort of a control deck. You're going to want to be defensive, and so the -2/-0 could be pretty relevant there. I don't know if it'll see any standard play. I think you would rather just play like in mono blue tempo or mono blue flyers. You would rather just play something like the Stormfleet Aerialist, the 1/2 that if you triggered raid, then it becomes a 2/3 for 2 with flying. I think you'd rather just play that one, but I think for maybe something like Pauper as well, because it has the fairy subtype, could potentially be fine to go along with Spellstutter Sprite. Again, nothing too crazy here from those cards. I do like the design on this one, Swirling Torrent, 6 mana for a sorcery, which is pretty expensive, but put target creature on top of its owner's library and return target creature to its owner's hand. So you get to do 2 of these effects, basically clear out 2 blockers and then get in for the final points of damage. I do like that there's also one mode that's putting it on top of its owner's library. Those effects are generally pretty strong and limited because you're cutting off their potential draw that they could hit, maybe a bomb that they have still in their deck, or just a more powerful card that they have still in their deck, and it kind of locks out their draw step for the turn, which can be pretty important and limited. Thought Collapse is your basic cancel. Little bit of, extra text on here, but it's basically cancel. Nothing too crazy here. Something I want to point out with the removal spells, it feels like a lot of the removal spells in this set are much more expensive than they are in previous sets where you would see things like maybe a 3 mana do something, 4 mana do something. A lot of the removal spells in this set are 5 mana plus. So Clear the Stage, 5 mana for -3/-3 with a little bit of bonus. Consign to the Pit, also 6 mana with a little bit of bonus. Grotesque Demise is like the only one that's 3 mana or less. This one being at common, though, is pretty nice. We have seen a similar card in Vanquish the Weak from Ixalan, as well as Reaver's Ambush, both of which basically did the same thing. I think Reaver's Ambush was the Exile one, and then Vanquish was just Destroy. So this one, basically a downshifted Reaver's Ambush, which I do like. 3 mana, takes care of anything power 3 or less, instant speed, perfectly fine. Another thing to point out is with the Exile, if they have something like Afterlife here, so if this was a 3/3 instead of a 5/3, you could target this thing, and this thing, when it would die, would actually knock at the Afterlife because you're exiling it and not killing it. So I do like having this at common. I think that'll be pretty good for the set. Again, nothing too crazy here. Plague White is something kind of interesting. I've been really impressed with Ornery Goblin during Guilds of Ravnica. This card is not Ornery Goblin, it's a worse Ornery Goblin, but I think it's still going to be a fine card for your limited decks. Nothing too crazy here. Again, 3 mana removal spell, but its opponent sacrifices a creature, which is kind of removal, but removes their worst creature, so not necessarily. Active Treason is back, which I think is quite good because of all the sacrifice effects that we have in this set. Daggercaster is essentially copies 5 through 8 of Goblin Chainwhirler. Yes, I am joking when I say that. This card is not standard playable, but is kind of a little bit reminiscent of Goblin Chainwhirler with that effect, but has a worse body and no first strike. Deface, I think, could be a fine sideboard card for your limited decks. Nothing too crazy here. Also nothing too crazy here. I think with these sort of cards, what we saw out of red was in the last set, most of the red cards we saw were just very aggressive. It feels like some of the cards that we're seeing here in red that are kind of like a little bit bigger are more for they're more how do I put it? They pass the vanilla test a lot easier. So like 6 mana, 6/6/6 has some upside to it. 5 mana 6/5 has some downside to it. If your 5 mana 6/5 in red isn't attacking each combat if able, you're probably doing something wrong. So I think that card's going to be perfectly fine too. Spear Spewer is a card that I like. 1 mana 0/2 Defender, taps to deal 1 damage to each player. Great way to turn on Spectacle for your Rakdos decks and just end the game a little bit faster. Aside from that, nothing else too crazy here. We've got a couple of reprints, Gift of Strength, Mammoth Spider, Root Snare, all reprints. Open the Gates could be an interesting one. Nice little fixing for your limited decks. Ceruli Caretaker is another one to maybe pay attention to. This card reminds me of Loam Dryad, and Loam Dryad actually managed to see play in Standard. So it is potential. There is potential that Ceruli Caretaker could also see play in Standard. Loam Dryad at least attacked for 1. Ceruli Caretaker can't really do that, but could, because it has that same effect as Loam Dryad, there is the potential there, especially if we end up seeing the Bant Walls deck end up being a real, competitor, a deck that's actually pretty good, which it looks like it might actually be, which is pretty nice. So Ceruli Caretaker could be a nice little 1-drop in that deck. Tower Defense, again, another key piece to a deck like that. creatures you control get +0/+5 and gain reach until end of turn. If your creatures are dealing damage with their toughness instead of their power, this card basically says creatures you control get +5/+5 until end of turn for just 2 mana, which is insane. Applied Biomancy, I like that one for standard as well. Final Payment, I think, is an interesting one here as well. 2 mana removal spell at instant speed. As an additional cost to cast the spell, pay 5 life or sacrifice a creature or enchantment. So it has the ability to enable your aristocrat shenanigans with also an upside of killing one of your opponent's creatures. But I think even for modern, this card has the potential to see play in some of the Death Shadow variants like Esper Death Shadow and the Abzan Traverse the Uvenwald Death Shadow list, because you can also pay 5 life and then you essentially have a terminate, which is perfectly fine. So it could actually just be a little bit more upside than downside, especially if you're running Death Shadow. So I think that this card is very good, maybe even for some sort of popper deck, again, some sort of aristocrat style strategy where you're trying to sacrifice creatures, or if you have some sort of an enchantment that maybe when it enters the battlefield does something but then doesn't really do anything, and you can just kind of like sacrifice the enchantment for free. That could be something you could do. You could sacrifice something like a Rancor as well, which when it hits the graveyard just returns back to your hand, and then you could replay the Rancor. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, for Pauper, Lawmage's Binding is very similar to a Faith Fetters effect, which doesn't gain you 4 life here, but is 1 mana cheaper. The 3/3 for 3 with upside, perfectly fine. This card I think is going to be fine for the Aristocrat style strategy as well. 1 mana 1/1, when it dies you get some upside, so again, could be another 1-drop for the Aristocrats deck. Screaming Shield is not a good card, but I do love the flavor text on it of shh. Very nice. Again, nothing else too crazy here, so that'll take us into the cards spoiled yesterday. So some of you guys may have already seen these. This is the Ravnica Allegiance Mythic Edition. So Domri, Dakfaden, Ajani Mentor of Heroes, Jaya Ballard, Kaya Orzhov Usurper, Tamio the Moon Sage, Karn, Scion of Urza, and Sorin Markov are the 8 Planeswalkers in Mythic Edition this time. They've said that they've made some changes to Mythic Edition. There's an entire article put out by Wizards that you guys can read where they kind of talked about what changes they made to Mythic Edition so that it would be a much smoother process this time around than it was last time around. So yeah, these are some additional cards then that were spoiled yesterday when I didn't get to make my video. Again, nothing too crazy here. Gateway Sneak I think is pretty interesting. 3 mana 1/3 enters the battlefield under your when a gate enters the battlefield under your control, then it can't be blocked this turn. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it's just like a better Ophidian, which is kind of nice. Resolute Watchdog, again, just like a fine 1-drop again for possibly the Defenders deck. Has a way to protect your Arcades in Standard, which is the main way of making the Walls deck work. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, nothing else too crazy here. Shout out to Magic with Zuby for getting a pretty sweet spoiler card here this time around. He's one of my friends here on YouTube. Check out his podcast if you haven't, Magic with Zuby. Forbidding Spirit, 3 mana 3/3 whenever it enters the battlefield. Until your next turn, creatures can attack you or a planeswalker you control, unless their controller pays 2 for each of those creatures. 3 mana 3/3 with upside. Perfectly fine for limited. Not sure it's going to see standard play. Maybe sideboard play against tokens. I could kind of see that. But yeah, it's going to be a perfectly fine card for limited. I don't see this going past like maybe 4th pick. Yeah, it's just hard to pass something that, you know, already passed the vanilla test and then has upside on it. Cavalcade of Calamity, I think is a nice little build-around card here as well. 2 mana enchantment, whenever a creature you control with power 1 or less attacks, this thing deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker that creature is attacking. That could be a nice way of, again, making all of your 1 mana, or not 1 mana, well, possibly 1 mana, but 1 power or less creatures do essentially an extra point of damage that's essentially unblockable, which is pretty nice. Macabre Mockery I think is cool because it targets your opponent's stuff, and you can, because it's instant speed, you can wait until the beginning of the end step of your opponent and then just kind of get them out of nowhere. Maybe do like Macabre Mockery in their end step, get the creature, and then untap. You still have that creature in play because you haven't hit the beginning of the next end step yet. So you have that creature in play, has +2/+0, gets to attack, and then maybe you active treason another one of their blockers, and then just have a great tempo swing in your favor for the Rakdos deck. Persistent Petitioners is kind of an interesting one here as well. It's a mill card that you can run any number of, and you can tap for untapped advisors you control. Target player puts the top 12 cards of their library into their graveyard, so it'll be interesting to gather or search how many advisors we have in Standard right now and see what sort of a deck you can make out of Persistent Petitioners. I like this card here as well. This card is a Stifle effect, taped onto a copy creature effect, which is nice. The uncommon split card here is also fine. Collision Colossus. This card is going to be solid for limited, possibly even maybe for standard for like a Gruul aggro strategy. It's a way to kill Lyra Dawnbringer, and in the matchups where they don't have Lyra Dawnbringer or some relevant flyer, then it's just a pump spell, which I think could be fine. And then finally, the last three cards that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about here on the channel. Sundering Shaman, 4 mana, 5/5 for limited. Card's going to be perfectly fine. Biogenic Ooze, this card is ridiculous. 5 mana, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 green Ooze creature token. At the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each Ooze you control, and then for 4 mana, create a 2/2 green Ooze creature token. So this card works really, really well on its own. If they don't have a way of maybe using Shock or Lightning Strike to kill off the Biogenic Ooze before the chance of putting the +1/+1 counters on the oozes. I do like that it's able to work. It's able to self-contain itself, which is nice, and you don't really need too much to build around. If you wanted to play some sort of ooze tribal deck, you could think about whatever the card from Ixalan is, forced adaptation, or no, not forced adaptation, whatever the adaptive adaptation, something like that, where it's a blue enchantment where creatures become the creature type of your choice. That card could be pretty sweet here with Ooze, because then this basically reads at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, which could be pretty nice as well. So I think this card is going to be pretty solid. It's just going to be a matter of how many Shocks and Lightning Strikes are running around to deal with the Biogenic Ooze before the ability to really get out of hand. And then finally, Captive Audience. This is like I don't normally like these effects. These effects are just too expensive for me. 7 mana for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield under your control, it enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. So you give this to your opponent as an enchantment, and then it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that hasn't been chosen. So their life total becomes 4. They discard their hand, or each opponent creates 5 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So it has 3 really punishing effects, but it's just too expensive. I guarantee that I'm going to lose games to it. I can 100% assure that. But if I'm playing Rakdos, I'm not looking to be the Captive Audience deck. I'm looking to be the 2 mana 2/2s with haste, whatever that card was that was previously spoiled that has fantastic artwork. I'm looking to be the Fireblade Artist deck if I'm playing Rakdos. I'm not looking to be the tap out for 7 mana for an enchantment in my deck, in my Rakdos deck. That's not what I'm looking to do in Rakdos. So I don't know. Maybe you guys like it a little bit more for maybe some sort of a commander deck, maybe like Zancha, where you're just kind of donating everything to other players that then have downside. But yeah, I think this set looks pretty sweet. That has been the last card here. This set, now that we know every card in it, I think I like Guilds of Ravnica better, but this set does look like it's going to be a fun one to draft as well. Of course, you guys can go to Mythic Spoiler, check out all the cards for yourself as well. 259 cards in the set, as well as the additional 8 from the Mythic Edition, and then also the Planeswalker deck cards as well. I think those were spoiled recently as well, but I don't think they were put in this article. So, or not in this article, but in the spoiler. So yeah, with that being said, hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. This will be the last spoiler video because we now know every card in the set, and now we can start focusing on some pre-release content, which should be pretty sweet. Maybe some deck techs as well. So if you guys are looking forward to that, be sure to leave a like on the video, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content here in the near future. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys here next time for another Magic the Gathering video. Thank you all so much for sticking it out with me during the spoiler season. We went over every single card that was spoiled from Ravnica Allegiance throughout the course of a few videos, so it was definitely a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it. If you want to see more when the next set comes out, be sure to let me know down low in the comments section. At the end of all of my videos, I love to give a huge shout out and thank you to the people supporting me over on the Patreon page. Patrons will be doing your giveaway reward cards. We'll be doing the drawing for those at the end of this week, so during the weekend. Probably even tomorrow, actually, maybe Sunday. But yeah, it should be a fun time again. So again, thank you to all of my patrons: Jeremy, Rodrigo, Jason, Daniel, BattleFMTG, Down Under MTG, and Jayathy Swarn for supporting me on the Patreon page. You guys will be getting your reward cards and the reward video very soon. So again, thank you so much for the support on the Patreon page. Thank you so much to you just for making it to the end of this video. It truly means a lot to me, and I'll see you guys here next time.